Well, good evening, Facebook Live studiers of the Bible and books about the Bible. Welcome to our Bible study this evening. Once again, this is session 5 of this book called What is the Bible by Rob Bell. And I am using the format here of reading to you pieces of what Bell has to say, and then people in the room, or if you would like to comment online with a question at any time, I try to keep track of the questions as they're coming in, so that if you have a comment or a question you'd like to make, feel free to go ahead and just post it. And if it's a question, I'll try to answer it, and we'll just move ahead like that. So I hope you all are having a wonderful Advent season, and this is a great way to spend some time together as we get into the scripture. The last session ended with three short chapters where Bell was discussing the flood stories, both from the scripture, the Old Testament and Hebrew scriptures, but also from many of the old myths of other ancient religions. Or other ancient cultures often have a flood story where the god or the gods starts over with humanity. And so there was a discussion of Noah, and then a brief discussion of the story of Jonah and the whale or the large fish, and Jonah's relationship with God and his obedience to God or disobedience to God. And then finally there was the story of Abraham and Isaac. So we've just finished those 3 short stories with commentary about each one of those. And tonight we're going to start the next chapter, which begins, it's going to give you kind of a recap of those 3 and pull some ideas together about those 3 stories. So I'm going to start with, if you have Bell's book, it's in chapter 15. And if not, just sit back and listen and come along for the ride. So welcome back to What is the Bible? Chapter 15 is titled, He Had No Idea What He Was Talking About. Floods, fish, and a sun. Those are 3 of the most famous stories in the Bible, and they're often the stories that people point to when they're insisting that the Bible is a primitive book, deeply out of touch with the modern world. A flood in which God orders the destruction of everybody on the earth but one family. A man being swallowed by a fish and living to tell about it. A God who commands someone to kill his own kid. Crazy, barbaric, destructive, fairy tales, outdated. The list goes on. But then we read them, keeping in mind what the world was like at that time. And what we saw was that in each of the stories, there was something new happening, something better, something pulling people forward. An understanding of God not based on destruction, but on relationship. Forgiving your enemies so that you wouldn't keep the violence in circulation. A divine being who wants to bless and show favor. A divine being who provides. These ideas were all leaps forward for that day. Progress, enlightenment, hope, the raising of consciousness. So when you read the Bible in its context, you learn that it is a library of radically progressive books calling humanity forward into a better future. The point of the Abraham and Isaac story isn't that you should sacrifice your child, but that you can leave behind any notion of a God who demands that you sacrifice your child. Do you see how huge that is? Several years ago, I had a conversation with a fancy pants famous pastor, please tell me you're laughing at that description, who has a massive following and had written me a letter because he had concerns about my work. I learned that having concerns is what leader folks say when they are really disturbed. We started talking, and he started asking questions. And quite quickly, I noticed that when I would say something good about how I understood God, he would immediately say something violent and awful about God. For example, I might say, Jesus spoke about the renewal of all things, and I think it's fascinating that he didn't speak of some things, or Christian things, or religion things, but all things. And then the pastor would counter with, but God might decide to send everybody to hell to torture them forever. and then he'd quote a verse from the Bible. Then I would say something like, isn't it interesting how when the Apostle Paul wrote about Jesus dying on the cross, he said it's all part of the reconciliation of all things. And then he'd say something like, but God told them to kill all the women and children in that village in the book of Judges, and sometimes God commands you to do difficult things that you do not understand. Everything I said, he countered with a verse or a story from the Bible about how cruel and punishing God might decide to be, including his continuing insistence that God just might decide to send everybody to hell to burn forever because all of humanity deserves it. When I pointed out that if God is like that, able to decide that about all humanity, then couldn't God possibly decide not to send everybody to burn forever in hell? If God is that random, as this pastor kept insisting, why does it always have to be horrible random? Couldn't God go both ways on the random thing? Why not good random? Isn't that the God who Jesus talked about? The one who gives people equal pay for working fewer hours and invites the losers to the parties? Actually, that is Jesus' point. Over and over again, that's Jesus' point. To which this pastor would inevitably counter with something about how you can't trust these sorts of stories because of, and then he'd quote something brutal from the Old Testament. If you're thinking, that sounds like it was fairly awkward conversation, it was. We went back and forth like this for a bit until it dawned on me what was going on between us. And I said, I don't read the Bible like a flat line. I don't see all of the passages in the Bible sitting equally side by side so that you can pick one and then counter it with another and go back and forth endlessly, leading you to the barbaric and violent and random nature of life and God. I read it looking for what the story is doing, what's happening within it, what new perspective is emerging, what new idea is being presented, what sense is being heightened. The stories in the Bible and the Bible itself have an arc, a trajectory, a movement and momentum like all great stories have. There are earlier parts in the story and there are later parts in the story. The story is headed somewhere. He said he had no idea what I was talking about. Ouch. So let's review. The Bible was written by people. People wrote things down over a long period of time. The things that they wrote down, some of which began as oral tradition, gradually took shape as a library we know to be the Bible. Books were left out, writings were edited, things were added, decisions were made about which books belonged, and eventually the library of books we know to be the Bible came to be the Bible. These things people wrote down reflected the world at their time in their context. These stories they told and the explanations they gave for how and why these things happened like they did were filtered through categories and understandings of the world that they lived in. When you read the Bible, you read it as an unfolding story. You don't edit out the earlier bits or pretend like they're not there. They reflect how people understood things in that time, in that place. You read the stories in light of where they're headed. The earlier bits reflect how people understood things at that point in history, but the stories keep going. The Bible comes out of actual human history, reflecting the funky, flawed, frustrating world these stories came out of. And right there in the midst of those stories, you often see growth and maturing and expanding perspectives. Before we go on, I want to interject a couple of things. What Bell is talking about here is what we call the living word, and that's a Lutheran concept for the word. But when he talks about not reading the Bible specifically for what it's saying, but for where it's headed, what's the point of the story, listening and interacting and having an experience, a relationship with God through the story. we are going back to be with them back then. And as we have this relationship, this ongoing relationship with the stories in the Bible, we are experiencing the inspiration of Scripture. We are experiencing this back and forth between our lives and the lives of the people that were being written about, and all of the history in between, all of the changes and the edits and the decisions that were made about how to advance the story, and now to include us in the experience of the people that were in the story. So it is a living word. It's a continuing story that we get to be part of as we also are understanding the point and the changes and the new life that exists in the Bible as we read these stories. So back to Belle's text. Now let's talk about all that violence in some of the stories. Chapter 16, all that violence. From Genesis 12. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go." So Abram went. In the ancient Near East, your tribe was your family, your bloodline, your home, your identity. Your tribe was everything, and everyone belonged to a tribe. You worked for the well-being of your tribe, as did everyone else in the tribe. You accumulated possessions, fought battles, made alliances, all in the name of tribal preservation. And if you did something unacceptable, something shameful, it reflected poorly on your tribe. According to the story in Genesis 12, God calls a man named Abram to be the father, the leader of a new tribe. We just keep returning to this, don't we? Abram is promised that all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Tribes at that time existed for their own well-being and preservation, like anything has changed in thousands of years. But this tribe, the one that Abram would lead, would be different, an idea that is still ahead of its time. This tribe would exist to bless all the other tribes, and this was a brand new idea. As this tribe of Abram's kids grew, they carried with them this sense of calling, this sense that they were different, that they had a unique role to play in the world. Tribes had gods and goddesses, forces they followed and worshiped, who they believed protected and guided them. So when you went into battle against another tribe, usually for land or access to resources or wealth, you were doing battle with them, but at the same time, your God was confronting their God. That's what was going on in the David and Goliath story. And when you won, you wiped them out and took all their stuff. Why? Because what if you left some of the men alive, and then later they banded together? Maybe the son of the king you killed was their leader, and they came to get revenge. You couldn't risk it. Or maybe you killed the men but took the women for yourselves, and the donkeys and whatever else you wanted. Those were called the spoils of war. There were rules about how this worked, because tribes had been doing it this way for a long time. Was it brutal? Yes. Was it violent? Yes. Primitive? Yes. Barbaric? Yes. Your tribal identity wasn't just about your bloodline and your gods. It was also about safety. The world was extremely dangerous, and without the protection of a tribe, you could easily find yourself enslaved or worse by any other tribe. This was not like picking a political party or a religious affiliation in our world. In that world at that time, your survival was at stake. When you read those Old Testament stories about so-and-so accumulating so many fighting men and a certain number of swords or horses or camels, or making an alliance with King so-and-so, this wasn't a hobby. This was life or death, kill or be killed. And no matter how many battles you fought and won, you were always one battle away from the enemy crushing you and wiping out your entire tribe, or killing some of you and taking the rest back to be assimilated into the conqueror's tribe. This is why hospitality was so important to them. When strangers wandered into your camp, you invited them in and cared for them and made sure they were treated well, because the slightest snub or inhospitality could set off who knows what kind of intertribal conflict and violence, which is what was going on in the story about Sodom and Gomorrah. Imagine what would happen if the tribe next door obtained a new technology like iron or bronze. It would be terrifying, knowing that if there was a battle, you could be outgunned. Your entire way of life would be at stake. That's the tension between the Philistines and the Israelites during the David and Goliath story. It's in this world, at this time, that we read the story of a man called to be the father of a new nation, a new tribe, one that would exist not just for its own self-preservation, but also for a much higher purpose, to bless all the other tribes. This is the story of Abraham's tribe, also called Israel. Can you see how radical that idea was? Can you see how this idea would have taken a while to catch on? And can you see why Jesus keeps reminding his people of their original calling? Can you see how difficult it would have been to make this kind of leap in a culture in which tribal affiliation and preservation were the highest of values? Can you see how no matter what you've been told about who you are and what your calling was, you would still have a filter, a lens, a way that you saw the world? In light of this, does it surprise you when someone in the Bible wins a battle and then gives their gods the credit? That's what people did at the time. Does it surprise you when, after winning, they wiped out the women and children and then said their gods told them to do it? That's what people did at the time. Does it surprise you when they won and they let no one escape but put everyone to the sword and then said they did it with their God's power? That's what people did at the time. Does it surprise you when Lot says, "Don't rape them, have sex with my daughters"? That's what people did in tight situations. Does it surprise you that the view people had of their gods is quite similar to the views their neighbors had of their gods? That's how people saw the world. You find these stories violent and repugnant and barbaric, because they are. If you didn't find them shocking and awful and confusing, something is wrong with you. And people who read these stories and say, well, that's just how God is, have a very, very warped and dangerous view of God. The violence isn't that surprising. What's surprising is that among all that violence are new ideas about serving and blessing and non-violence. Here's what I mean. Do you find it primitive and barbaric to care for widows, orphans, and refugees? That's commanded in the book of Deuteronomy. Do you find it cruel and violent to leave a corner of your field unharvested so the poor can have something to eat? That's commanded in the book of Leviticus. Do you think people should be set free from slavery? That's the story in the book of Exodus. Do you think it's good to love your neighbor? That's commanded in the book of Leviticus. What you find in the Bible are stories accurately reflecting the dominant consciousness of the day. And yet right in among and sometimes even within those very same violent stories, you find radically new ideas about freedom, equality, justice, compassion, and love. New ideas sit side by side with old ideas. Vicious violence is right there next to new understandings of peace and justice, kind of like now. One more truth about all that violence in the Bible. You being shocked and repulsed by the violence in those stories may be the writer's intention in telling those stories. And this is me talking now. Just remember that the Bible is not an eyewitness reporter's story of things that happened. Okay, keep that in mind. This is not supposed to be the daily newspaper. This is supposed to be a way to bring about change and a new way to tell an old story. Back to Bel. As we keep coming back to this theme, somebody somewhere decided to edit and arrange these particular stories in this particular way. There was something they were trying to say by what they included and what they left out. The Hebrew scriptures, sometimes called the Old Testament, were compiled for the first time in Babylon. Why is this significant? Because Jerusalem was conquered in the 500 BC by the Babylonians, who were the military superpower of their day. And a number of the citizens of Jerusalem were forced into exile in Babylon. They found themselves miles from home in a foreign land, surrounded by people who didn't talk like them, or think like them, or believe like them. They found themselves on the receiving end of horrific violence, and it's there that they edit together a series of texts that include horrific violence, which is their point. Those stories containing senseless violence point out how senseless violence is. It's as if the editors compiled these stories are just as horrified by all that violence as we are. These stories end up being a critique of the cycle that is perpetuated whenever someone goes to battle thinking God is on their side. All of which leads us to another dimension of something more going on here, this one involving then and now. I want to comment, this is the end of that chapter, and oftentimes people, I think, and we were talking about this a little bit before around the table, that there seems to be this understanding that, and we divide the Bible into the Old Testament God and the New Testament God. The Old Testament God is the God sitting on the cloud with a lightning bolt, waiting for us to do something to mess up so that he can punish us. And the New Testament God somehow, got religion or something and became, gentle Jesus, meek and mild, the loving God, the one who would never hurt us, that sort of thing. But there is so much of this new understanding of peace and justice and nonviolence in the Old Testament that we miss if we want to categorize God in Old Testament terms or in New Testament terms. And I'm putting that in quotes because there is no one image of God in the Old Testament. I mean, we have wonderful images in the Old Testament that have nothing to do with violence. We have, like a mother hen gathering her chicks under her wings. We have, Sophia, the wisdom God. We have all kinds of God walking alongside of us or being present with us in visions and drawing us into relationship over and over again. So, this is one of the things we need to always be keeping in mind when we start to categorize God as one way up until the page turn into the New Testament. And then all of a sudden God, sees the light and becomes something different. So think on that. Any other questions? Comments from the table? Any comments from anybody who's listening? Okay, I'm going to go on to chapter 17. I want to keep my time going here so that I know for sure I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. Chapter 17 is titled, Do What to Our Whats? Alternately titled, Bite Down Hard, My Man. In Genesis 17, Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised. Okay, I should probably tell you this whole chapter is going to be a little more than PG. So if that's a problem, if you have youngsters listening, you might be ready to explain this. Okay, ready? Circumcision. Really? Yes. There's something going on in this Genesis 17 story about God and Abraham that teaches us about how we grow and evolve as humans, something that has tremendous significance for each of us today, especially in reading the Bible. A bit about circumcision. We've continually seen that the early parts of the Bible are about the formation and identity of a new kind of tribe, a tribe led by Abraham, a tribe with a calling to show the world the redeeming love of God. And how do you grow in a tribe? Well, how do you grow a tribe? There are several ways, the most obvious being you have kids. And how do you have kids? You have sex. And how does that work? Excellent question, because the ancient world had a much more limited knowledge of biology than we do. They didn't know what we know about conception and zygotes and sperm and eggs and all that. What they observed is that women didn't get pregnant unless they'd been with a man. They concluded then that the man must be the one who has the life force, the seed, the magic bullet within him, and that when he gives it to the woman, that's when, when life begins. And for him to give it to her, he passes it through his, you're with me here, right? Every male among you shall be circumcised, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and you. Circumcision was how these people, men, demonstrated their commitment to being a part of this new tribe, and then growing and building this new tribe. A dude without any drugs or painkillers would have skin cut off of the most potent, vulnerable part of his body as a way of saying, I'm in, I believe, I trust, I want to do my part in this new thing that God is doing. Picture Abraham, 99 years old, biting down on a towel while his neighbor Jeff takes a stone and goes to work. It's not like they had sharp metal knives or ibuprofen or anything like that. And if you're wondering why men would put themselves through such pain, remember that initiation rites usually involve some sort of pain, whether it's a fraternity or a sports team or an intern at a law firm working 100-hour weeks. So as the story progresses, we see circumcision becoming more than just a little operation on the man's point, but a whole way of dividing the world, with some people being circumcised and others, heathens, pagans, everybody who isn't us, etc., being referred to as the uncircumcised. Remember the shepherd boy David hearing Goliath going on and asking the men standing next to him, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? Circumcision was a sign of tribal identity, a mark that you were committed to being a new kind of people in this world. Now, fast forward a number of years to the New Testament. The Apostle Paul, a member of this tribe, is traveling around the ancient world telling people about Jesus. And there's a group of people from his tribe hot on his trail, telling people that if you want to follow Jesus, you have to be circumcised. It's part of the deal, they say. It's been the sign from the beginning. Picture a group of Greeks or Romans who have never heard of Abraham, never read the Torah, never made any commitments to being a new kind of tribe for the world. But they're compelled by the Jesus message about a new humanity. And now they've just been told that if they're going to follow him, they are going to need to have a little operation. They stand there dumbfounded, saying, you want us to do what to our whats? The point is very simple. And yet it's one of the main reasons so many get so tied up in knots reading the Bible. First, when Abraham is told he's going to be a father for the first time, and then he's going to become the leader of an entire nation, he is a 99-year-old man. Abraham laughed at this. God makes people laugh in the Bible. When you hear the word God, is that one of the first things that comes to mind? Laughing? But tribes need initiations, rites, rituals, ways of determining who's serious and who's not, who's in and who's not, who wants to be a part of the new thing and who doesn't. And the way these wandering tribesmen thousands of years ago did this was through circumcision. It was a sign, a mark, a tangible demonstration of your identity, until it wasn't. By the time his first followers were spreading Jesus' message, it had become a major source of conflict, with some saying you need to be circumcised to follow Jesus and others, like Paul saying that you didn't. This conflict is at the heart of the letter to the Galatians in the New Testament, in which the Apostle Paul uncorks an epic rant about how people getting circumcised to follow Jesus isn't a gospel at all. And anybody preaching a gospel involving circumcision is cursed, and anybody believing them is bewitched and enslaved. At one point, he writes about these pro-circumcision people. I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves. The Greek word here for emasculate is apokopto. It literally means to cut off. I wish they would cut theirs off. So how did circumcision, which was central to the story early on, become a problem later? How did something that was considered good and commanded by God early in the story become something Paul calls enslavement? First, Paul doesn't have a problem with circumcision. It's important to point that out. He has a problem with how it's being used. It's a good thing being used in a bad way. Second, if you take two bits out of different places in the Bible and hold them up side by side, they may appear to be saying very different things because they are saying very different things. You'll often see this in criticisms of the Bible. People quote a verse from one place and refer to a story from another, and then mention a passage from earlier or an idea from later as evidence of how primitive or contradictory it is. You have to read it differently. You have to ask where you are in the story. You have to read it not as a flat line in which you can pick and choose, but as a reflection of how people saw things at different places in the story. I regularly get questions about the Bible that begin with a line like this: why didn't God just, followed by something like this, send everybody to heaven so they wouldn't have to suffer? Or skip the sacrificial system because it was pointless? Or not put that tree in the garden? Or come up with some way to fix things without Jesus having to die? Behind these sorts of questions is the belief that the Bible records one version of events that could easily have been changed if God had just decided to act in another way. But that's not what we have in the Bible. What we have are poems, letters, and stories written by real people living in real places in real time. When Paul talks about circumcision, he explains it as something meaningful at that time, something that served its purpose, something that pointed forward to what was coming. It wasn't wrong, it was then, and then is not now. So when people take then and try to make it now, they're missing the point, working against the fundamental orientation of this library that we call the Bible. Are there things that were true then that are true now? Of course. And this library is about the God who meets us at whatever place we're at and invites us to trust and believe that there is more, that we're just getting started, that we've only just begun. So why don't we just ignore the earlier bits? The reason why the earlier bits are so interesting is that they show you what growth and movement look like. Part of the power of reading earlier stories is when you spot the movement, it can better help you spot movement in your life and in the world now. When I was starting out as a pastor, I would often hear people say, "We need to get back to how they did it in the early church." The idea behind this statement was that there is an ideal state or culture or way of doing things that if you could just get back there, then you'd be all set. But reading the Bible, you learn that it's not about trying to be something you're not. It's about learning to see the movement and motion and possibilities right in the midst of whatever world you find yourself in. We are not living in the first century or the ancient Near East. We are here now, at this time, in this world. And so we don't need to replace one culture with another. We open our eyes to the divine invitation right here, right now, in this one. So when we move on, we will follow a few stories about Jesus before we ask the question, how did Jesus read the Bible? Okay, I want to step away from the text here for just a minute and talk about this whole idea of how we are watching the story grow. And I was just struck by things about when people enter into a story like Harry Potter or Star Wars or, something like that, and they find themselves in that story. I think it's probably, a good economics if you're a storyteller to know what happened beforehand, to go back to the past, to do the prequel, to do Star Wars 1, 2, and 3 after people already know 4, 5, and 6. People want to know more about the backstory of the characters and of the interactions and of the relationships. And it's a good way to tell stories, is to start in the middle and move people forward and then go back and say, oh, but I forgot to tell you about this part of the person's story, which is one of the reasons why it's important for us to read and to study and to listen and do research on the Old Testament accounts, so that we can see how people grew, how people accepted and then rejected and accepted and then rejected different ideas as they were moving towards us. So I think that's really an interesting way to look at, this is not a book of instructions as much as it is a story that we can come in and out of and learn from, relate to, and get to places where you can follow along with the story and how it relates to you. I from my theater background, one of the things that I remember was when you're taking on a role as an actor and there is no information about the character except for what's going on with the character in the story or in the play, you have to create the character's backstory. And you have to carry that in you as if it is just as real as your own story, so that if someone were to ask you a question about the character that didn't have anything to do with the play, that you would know enough about the story that you created for the character to make it real. And I think that's not that the Old Testament was creating a backstory for something that had already happened, but we have access to the story because most of us Christians have entered the story in the story of Jesus. We begin with the Christmas story, we follow his life and his teachings and his ministry, and we watch him die and be raised and then see his community form. We know those stories, but now to be able to knit together all the other stories that come before Jesus appears, and see where we might fit, do we relate to Abraham, an old man who's going to start a family? Do we relate to Jonah, who hears very clearly what God wants him to do and yet goes the opposite direction? Do we relate to Job, for whom everything is going wrong and yet he continues to be faithful to God? How do we relate to those people and to those experiences? And then how do those fit into the story of us? Kind of like the TV show, This Is Us, but now we're starting, if you follow that, now you're beginning to see more and more of the history of these characters, which help you understand why they act the way they act and why they interact and why they react because of what has happened to them in the past. And that's why it's important for us to really have some familiarity and some understanding of the Old Testament as we move ahead, of the Hebrew Bible, as we move ahead into the Christian scriptures. And I think for those of us who are Lutheran, it's important for us to not only understand our Jewish roots of Christianity, but our Roman Catholic roots as we move ahead, because all of those are pieces of our story as we move ahead in our Christian walk, interpreting picking up pieces that mean a lot and letting pieces go that don't, for our time and or for our system of belief. So that's kind of the way we go there. So let me just pick up that last piece from him. But reading the Bible, you learn it's not about trying to be something you are not. It's about learning to see the movement and motion and possibilities right in the midst of whatever world you find yourself in. We are not living in the first century or the ancient Near East. We are here now at this time in this world. And so we don't need to replace one culture with another. We open our eyes to the divine invitation right here, right now, in this world. So think about that as you keep moving through the Advent season. And because the next section is really a kind of a diverse section from what we've been doing, I'm going to take the break now and have some conversation with the people at the table. But if you have any questions, I'm going to go ahead and close up for tonight. The next time that I will be doing this, I will put it up on Facebook, but it will probably be in about 2 weeks, which would bring us into the week right after Christmas. So just watch Facebook, and I'll try to get some notifications up there. But I know for certain we will be meeting the second week in January. So I'll put that schedule up on Facebook, and I hope you all continue a blessed Advent and have a very Merry Christmas holiday. And don't forget to worship. Thanks for being with me tonight.